The doors of the grand chamber sealed shut with a heavy metallic hiss, and every alien delegate froze in place. A masked figure stood near the center platform, one arm wrapped tightly around the throat of a young human aide named Emma Foley. The room, usually filled with calm diplomatic murmurs, went utterly silent. Emma's eyes darted across the chamber, wide with fear, searching for any face that might help her. The intruder's voice cut through the silence, sharp and demanding, warning everyone not to move. Souther Grace Whitfield, the lead human diplomat, stood only a few meters away, her hands raised slowly. She had come to this session expecting nothing more than routine trade discussions. Instead, she now stared at a stranger holding her colleague hostage in front of representatives from 12 different worlds. Her heart pounded, but her face remained still, almost unreadable. The council members, seated on a raised crescent of chairs above the floor, watched with a strange mixture of alarm and curiosity, as if observing an experiment rather than a crisis. Among the observers was Elder Vorkaith, a silver-skinned representative from a species known for its calm, almost emotionless demeanor. He leaned toward his aide and whispered that this was an opportunity to study how the newest council members, the humans, would react under pressure. Many species in the council still viewed humanity as fragile and unpredictable, more prone to panic than composed action. Vorkaith expected to see exactly that unfold in front of him. The masked intruder tightened his grip on Emma's collar and shouted that this session was over, unless his demands were met. He claimed to represent a faction opposed to human membership in the council, insisting that humanity's presence threatened the balance of power among older species. His voice trembled slightly, betraying nerves beneath his aggressive tone. Security drones hovered near the ceiling, their sensors locked onto the scene, yet none of them moved to intervene, restrained by strict non-interference protocols designed for diplomatic neutrality. Grace kept her eyes on Emma, silently urging her to stay calm. She took one careful step forward, her voice steady, as she asked the intruder what he truly wanted. She reminded him that violence would not change anyone's mind in this chamber, that words were the only currency that mattered here. For a brief moment, the intruder hesitated, his grip loosening just slightly. It seemed as though the situation might resolve peacefully, through calm negotiation alone. Then, without warning, a second figure emerged from behind one of the ornate pillars lining the chamber. This one carried a small device, blinking with red lights, clearly some kind of disruptor meant to overload the chamber's systems. The council's own security officers, stationed near the entrances, exchanged uneasy glances, unsure how to respond without breaking protocol. The tension in the room thickened, and for the first time, genuine fear crept into the eyes of several alien delegates who had never witnessed anything like this before. Near the back of the human delegation, seated quietly among translators and analysts, was Daniel Cole, head of the Human Council Security Detail. He had said nothing since the intruders appeared, his posture relaxed, almost too relaxed for the situation unfolding before him. His colleague, a sharp-eyed woman named Claire Bishop, sat beside him, her fingers resting lightly on the edge of her chair. To anyone watching closely, it might have seemed as though neither of them cared about the unfolding crisis. But beneath their calm exteriors, something else was happening. Daniel's breathing had slowed to a controlled rhythm, deep and measured. His eyes, though appearing unfocused, were actually tracking every movement in the room, calculating distances, angles, and timing. Claire's fingers tapped once against her wrist device, a silent signal only Daniel would recognize. Neither of them spoke, yet a wordless understanding passed between them, built from years of training that most species in the council had never even considered necessary. The alien biologists monitoring the chamber's environmental sensors noticed something strange. Subtle spikes registered in the readings coming from the human section of the room, changes in body temperature, heart rate, and something else entirely, a pattern their instruments had never recorded before. One young analyst leaned toward her supervisor, whispering that the human readings did not match any known stress response in their database. Her supervisor frowned, adjusting the sensor calibration, assuming a malfunction rather than something genuinely unprecedented. Meanwhile, the masked intruder grew impatient. He shouted again, demanding that the council immediately vote to revoke humanity's membership, or he would ensure the aides suffered the consequences. Emma's breathing grew shallow, tears welling in her eyes, though she fought to remain still, remembering the brief training every diplomatic staff member received before joining these sessions. She focused on Grace's calm expression, drawing strength from her steady presence across the chamber floor. Grace continued speaking, her tone gentle but firm, buying time with careful words. She acknowledged the intruder's frustration, expressing genuine understanding for his concerns about change and uncertainty. She explained that humanity had joined the council seeking cooperation, not domination, and that harming an innocent aide would only weaken his cause in the eyes of every species watching. Her words seemed to reach him, if only slightly, his shoulders sagging as doubt crept into his resolve. Elder Vorkaith, still observing intently, noted the strange dynamic unfolding before him. He had expected human diplomats to freeze, perhaps even beg for mercy, yet Grace's composure defied every assumption his species held about humanity. He turned his gaze toward Daniel and Claire, still seated calmly among the delegation, and felt an unfamiliar sense of unease settle over him, though he could not yet explain why. The second intruder, holding the blinking device, moved closer to the central control console, clearly intent on disabling the chamber's systems entirely. Security drones adjusted their positions slightly, still bound by protocol, unable to act without explicit authorization from the council itself. The room's tension stretched further, every delegate now fully aware that this crisis had moved beyond simple negotiation, edging toward something far more dangerous with each passing second. Daniel's eyes finally shifted, meeting Claire's for the briefest moment. Something passed between them, unspoken, yet absolutely clear. Claire's hand moved slowly toward the small comm device clipped to her sleeve, her thumb resting gently against its surface. Neither of them showed any outward sign of urgency, yet their entire focus had narrowed completely onto the two intruders standing at opposite ends of the chamber, calculating every possible outcome. Emma, still held firmly by the first intruder, caught a brief glimpse of Daniel's face across the room. Something in his expression, calm yet intensely focused, gave her an unexpected sense of reassurance. Did not understand why, but somehow she knew that the stillness surrounding the human delegation was not weakness at all. It was something else entirely, something patient, coiled, and waiting for exactly the right moment to unfold. As the second intruder's device let out a sharp beep, signaling it was seconds from activating, the entire chamber seemed to hold its breath. Council members leaned forward in their seats. Alien security officers tensed near the doorways, and Grace's voice faltered for just a moment as she realized words alone might not be enough anymore. The fragile balance of the room teetered on the edge of something irreversible, and everyone present, human and alien alike, sensed that the next few seconds would change everything. Nearby, a young translator from a moss-covered world pressed herself against her console, her four eyes wide as she watched the scene unfold. She had only recently been assigned to the human delegation, eager to study a species her professors had described as endlessly talkative yet strangely predictable. Nothing in her studies had prepared her for the sight of a hostage held at the center of the galaxy's most important diplomatic chamber, nor for the strange calm radiating from the very people she had expected to react with the most fear. Elder Vorkaith's earlier detachment had fully dissolved by now, replaced by something closer to genuine dread. He had witnessed conflict before, disputes between rival trade guilds, occasional border disagreements among neighboring systems, but nothing quite like this. A direct threat unfolding within the supposedly secure walls of the council chamber itself. He found himself gripping the armrest of his seat, uncertain whether to call for immediate evacuation or trust that the situation might still resolve without further danger. Emma Foley's mind drifted briefly to her family back on Earth, to ordinary mornings and quiet routines that suddenly felt impossibly distant. She had accepted this position eager to see the galaxy beyond her homeworld, never imagining her first major council session would unfold this way, and she forced the thought aside, focusing instead on Grace's calm voice, letting it anchor her against the fear threatening to overwhelm her entirely. The first intruder's hand trembled slightly against Emma's shoulder, betraying nerves beneath his aggressive posture. He had rehearsed this moment countless times in his mind, imagining a swift, decisive victory that would force the council to reconsider humanity's presence once and for all. Reality, however, felt far messier than his careful planning had anticipated, the weight of an actual hostage far heavier than any imagined scenario had prepared him for. Security officers stationed near the chamber's outer doors exchanged frustrated glances, their hands hovering near sidearms they were forbidden to use without explicit authorization. One veteran officer, a broad-shouldered being who had served the council for nearly 3 decades, muttered quietly that he had never once imagined witnessing a crisis of this magnitude during a routine diplomatic session. His colleagues simply nodded, unable to find words adequate to the moment. Throughout the chamber, dozens of alien delegates sat frozen in their seats, their species' various instincts for danger activating in strange and unfamiliar ways. Some shrank lower behind their desks, others gripped the edges of their consoles tightly, and a few simply stared, transfixed, unable to look away from the unfolding drama. Despite their vast differences in appearance, biology, and culture, every single delegate shared the same overwhelming uncertainty about how this crisis might ultimately end. The beeping device in the second intruder's hand grew faster, its red light flashing in a steady countdown that everyone in the chamber could now hear clearly. Claire Bishop's thumb pressed gently against her comm device, sending a silent signal that traveled instantly to the small earpiece Daniel Cole wore beneath his collar. Neither of them moved from their seats, yet something had shifted in the air around them, a quiet readiness that seemed to spread outward like a current beneath still water. Grace Whitfield kept her voice level, still addressing the first intruder directly, though her mind now raced through every possible outcome. She understood that words had bought precious time, but the countdown on the device meant that time was quickly running out. She glanced briefly toward Daniel, a subtle exchange that lasted less than a second, yet carried an entire conversation within it. Daniel gave the faintest nod, so small that only Grace noticed it at all. The alien delegates seated along the crescent-shaped platform began murmuring among themselves, their earlier detached curiosity replaced by genuine alarm. Elder Vorkaeth's silver skin seemed to pale slightly as he watched the countdown device, aware that his species had no effective protocol for a crisis unfolding at this speed. He turned toward the council's chief security officer, a broad-shouldered being named Threll Orun, and demanded to know why the drones remained motionless despite the obvious danger. Threll Orun explained, his voice tense, that direct council intervention required a majority vote from the assembled members, a process that would take several minutes even under emergency conditions. Minutes, he admitted quietly, that they clearly did not have. The countdown device in the second intruder's hand had already reached its final stretch, each beep now arriving less than a second apart, filling the chamber with an unbearable sense of urgency. Emma Foley, still held against the first intruder, felt her knees weaken slightly, though she forced herself to remain standing. She caught Grace's eyes once more across the room, drawing a final measure of courage from her calm expression. The intruder holding her tightened his grip instinctively, sensing the shifting mood in the chamber, though he could not yet identify the source of his growing unease. Daniel Cole finally rose from his seat, moving slowly, almost casually, as though simply stretching after a long meeting. No alarm sounded, no dramatic gesture accompanied his movement, yet every alien delegate who happened to glance his way felt an inexplicable chill run through them. Claire Bishop rose beside him at the exact same moment, their timing so perfectly synchronized that it seemed almost rehearsed, though neither had spoken a single word aloud. The first intruder noticed the movement and barked a warning, demanding that everyone remain seated immediately. Daniel raised his hands slightly, palms open, his expression calm and non-threatening, the picture of a man simply trying to de-escalate the situation. His voice, when he spoke, carried a strange gentleness that seemed to momentarily disarm the intruder's suspicion, buying just enough space to close the distance between them. Claire moved differently, drifting almost lazily toward the side of the chamber, where the second intruder stood hunched over the countdown device. Her steps appeared unhurried, her posture relaxed, giving no outward indication of the precise calculations running through her mind with every passing second. The intruder, focused entirely on his device, failed to notice her approach until she was already within arm's reach. The countdown reached its final 3 seconds, and the chamber seemed to compress into a single suspended breath. Claire's hand shot forward with startling speed, closing over the device and wrenching it away before the intruder could react. She pressed a hidden switch along its side, a trick she had learned during years of specialized training, and the red light flickered once before dying completely. The countdown halted with barely a second to spare. At the same instant, Daniel closed the remaining distance to the first intruder, his movements suddenly transforming from calm to controlled and precise. He did not shout, did not hesitate, simply moved with the fluid certainty of someone who had rehearsed this exact scenario 1,000 times before, though in truth, he never had. His hand found the intruder's wrist with practiced ease, guiding it away from Emma with firm but careful pressure that avoided causing any real harm. Emma stumbled free, gasping as she finally caught her breath, and Grace rushed forward to steady her, wrapping an arm around her shoulders protectively. The first intruder, disoriented by how quickly the situation had turned against him, found himself gently but firmly guided to the floor, his balance completely lost before he even understood what had happened. Daniel knelt beside him, his voice calm, almost reassuring, instructing him to stay still and avoid making things worse for himself. Across the chamber, Claire secured the deactivated device under her arm, turning to face the second intruder, with an expression that held no anger, only quiet resolve. He backed away instinctively, hands raised, clearly recognizing that whatever advantage he believed he once held had evaporated entirely. Within moments, both intruders were subdued, their plan completely unraveled, the chamber's earlier chaos replaced by stunned, disbelieving silence. Elder Vorkaith stared at the scene before him, unable to fully process what he had just witnessed. Two human security officers had neutralized an armed hostage situation in a matter of seconds, without weapons, without shouting, without the frantic desperation his species had always associated with humanity's supposed fragility. He turned to Threll Oren, his voice barely above a whisper, asking how such a thing was possible from a species so recently deemed vulnerable and unpredictable. Threll Oren had no immediate answer, his own sensors still processing the readings gathered during the brief encounter. The data showed something extraordinary, patterns of movement and reaction time that exceeded every known benchmark in the Council's extensive database of species capabilities. He glanced toward the human delegation, where Daniel and Claire now stood quietly, almost casually, as though nothing unusual had just occurred at all. Grace Whitfield helped Emma into a nearby seat, checking gently to make sure she remained unharmed, aside from understandable shock. She then turned toward Daniel, offering a small, grateful nod, though her expression carried a trace of something else, a quiet awareness that the Council had just witnessed, something humanity rarely revealed so openly. Daniel returned her nod with equal subtlety, his calm demeanor already fully restored, as though the entire event had been nothing more than routine. The young alien analyst who had earlier flagged the unusual sensor readings now stared at her console in stunned silence, replaying the data over and over. The spikes she had dismissed as malfunction now made perfect sense, an entire physiological shift that had prepared Daniel and Claire for exactly this moment, though neither of them had shown any outward sign of it beforehand. She realized, with a growing sense of unease, that she had just witnessed the activation of something humanity itself rarely acknowledged. The council members began murmuring again, though the tone had changed entirely from earlier curiosity to something closer to cautious astonishment. Several delegates exchanged uneasy glances, silently reconsidering everything they thought they understood about their newest member species. The chamber, once filled with tension and fear, now buzzed with a different kind of energy entirely, a mixture of relief, confusion, and quiet, dawning realization. Elder Vorkaith rose slowly from his seat, his usual composed demeanor visibly shaken. He addressed the chamber directly, his voice carrying clearly despite its softness, requesting a formal recess to allow the council time to process what had just occurred. As the session was called to pause, his eyes remained fixed on Daniel and Claire, watching them move with the same calm efficiency as they escorted the subdued intruders toward the chamber's exit, still trying to understand what exactly humanity truly was. The young four-eyed translator who had watched the entire encounter unfold slowly lowered her hands from her console, realizing only now that she had been holding her breath for nearly a full minute. She turned to her supervisor, a weathered official who had served the council for longer than she had been alive, and asked quietly whether such restraint was typical of human security personnel. Her supervisor admitted he genuinely did not know, having never witnessed anything remotely similar during his own long career. The several delegates began recording formal statements for their respective governments, eager to relay what they had witnessed before rumors and exaggeration could distort the truth. One representative from a species known for exceptionally long memories noted for the official record that in over 3 centuries of council history, no crisis of this nature had ever been resolved so quickly or so cleanly, without a single serious injury on either side of the confrontation. Emma Foley remained seated where Grace had guided her, her hands still trembling slightly, as the adrenaline of the encounter slowly began to fade. A medical officer from the station's health division arrived promptly, kneeling beside her to check her vital signs and offer quiet reassurance. Emma waved off the more thorough examination, insisting she simply needed a few minutes to steady herself, though she gratefully accepted a cup of warm water offered by one of the officer's assistants. Daniel guided the first intruder toward the waiting security escort, his manner still calm and almost gentle despite the gravity of what had just occurred. The intruder, visibly shaken by how completely his plan had collapsed, asked quietly whether he would be treated fairly, given his cooperation in remaining still once subdued. Daniel assured him that the council's procedures were fair and transparent, offering the reassurance, not out of obligation, but out of genuine belief in the principles humanity had brought to this alliance. Claire, meanwhile, carefully packaged the deactivated device for transport to the station's forensic laboratory, handling it with the practiced precision of someone who understood exactly how much information such evidence might eventually reveal. She paused for a moment, glancing across the chamber toward Grace and Emma, allowing herself the briefest flicker of relief before returning her full attention to the task at hand, aware that the true investigation had only just begun. The recess did not bring calm to the station. Deep within the lower levels, far from the grand chamber, a third figure moved quickly through a maintenance corridor, his footsteps echoing against metal walls. His name was Corin Dahl, and he had been waiting outside the chamber the entire time, monitoring the situation through a hidden comlink. When the signal from his companions went silent, he understood immediately that something had gone terribly wrong with their plan. Corin pressed a hand against his earpiece, trying desperately to reach either of his partners, but only static answered him. He cursed under his breath and quickened his pace toward the station's secondary docking bay, where a small transport ship waited, fueled and ready for a swift escape. He had not expected the human security detail to react so quickly, and now he needed to vanish before anyone realized a third conspirator had ever existed. Back in the Grand Chamber, council officials worked to restore order following the brief recess. Threll Orin personally escorted the 2 subdued intruders toward a secure holding area, flanked by a small team of security drones, now finally cleared for action under emergency authorization. Daniel Cole walked a few steps behind, his expression calm but watchful, still scanning the corridors out of habit rather than necessity. Claire Bishop remained in the chamber, carefully documenting the deactivated device for later analysis. She noted its construction, the components used, and the frequency it had been tuned to disrupt. Her practiced eye recognized something troubling almost immediately, a design signature that suggested more sophisticated backing than a simple lone faction could arrange on its own. She flagged the device for priority review, her instincts telling her this incident was far from finished. Elder Vorkaith requested a private meeting with the human delegation once the chamber had been secured. Grace Whitfield agreed, though she insisted that Emma Foley be allowed to rest first, her well-being taking priority over any further discussion. The council obliged, and within the hour, Grace, Daniel, and Claire found themselves seated in a smaller meeting room with Vorkaith and Threll Arun, the atmosphere far more intimate and far more curious than the grand chamber had been. Vorkaith began cautiously, admitting that what he had witnessed challenged everything his species understood about humanity. He explained that early first contact reports, filed decades earlier during humanity's initial application for council membership, had briefly noted unusual physiological traits before being dismissed as incomplete or exaggerated observations from inexperienced diplomats. He now wondered aloud whether those old reports deserved a second look. Daniel exchanged a glance with Grace before answering carefully. He explained that humans possessed certain evolutionary traits inherited from their ancient ancestors, traits related to survival, coordination, and rapid response under extreme pressure. He described it simply: avoiding any dramatic language, calling it an old instinct that occasionally activated during moments of genuine danger, something most humans rarely experienced in their modern, largely peaceful lives. Threlorun leaned forward, his curiosity clearly overriding his usual professional restraint. He asked how such a trait could remain hidden for so long, especially during humanity's initial evaluation period before council membership was granted. Claire answered this time, explaining that human society had spent thousands of years building structures specifically designed to prevent this instinct from surfacing in everyday life. Education, cooperation, and shared values acting as constant, deliberate restraints. Grace added that humanity viewed this trait with complicated feelings, neither proud nor ashamed, but cautious and respectful of its potential. She explained that most humans went their entire lives without ever experiencing its activation, and those who did, like Daniel and Claire, underwent extensive training, specifically to ensure the trait remained controlled and purposeful, rather than dangerous or unpredictable. Vorkaeth absorbed this information slowly, his earlier unease shifting into something closer to genuine fascination. He admitted that his species, along with most council members, had long assumed humans were simply emotional and physically unremarkable, a species that had somehow talked its way into advanced technology, rather than earned it through natural capability. Today's events had shattered that assumption entirely. Meanwhile, Corandal reached the secondary docking bay, only to find it swarming with station security personnel, alerted by Claire's earlier analysis of the deactivated device. He froze at the entrance, realizing too late that his escape route had already been compromised. He turned to flee back into the corridors, his mind racing to formulate a new plan, panic beginning to creep into his otherwise carefully controlled demeanor. Back in the meeting room, Threlorun received an urgent notification through his earpiece, informing him of the situation unfolding at the docking bay. He excused himself briefly, stepping into the corridor to coordinate the response, leaving Daniel, Claire, and Grace alone with Vorkaeth for a few quiet moments. Vorkaeth used the opportunity to ask a more personal question, curious whether Daniel had felt frightened during the confrontation earlier that day. Daniel considered the question thoughtfully before answering honestly, and he admitted that fear had certainly been present, a natural response to the danger Emma faced, but explained that his training allowed him to channel that fear into focus rather than panic. He described the sensation as a strange kind of clarity, where everything around him seemed to slow down, allowing him to process information and make decisions with remarkable precision. Claire nodded in agreement, adding that the experience was never comfortable, despite how calm they might have appeared from the outside. She explained that the physical toll afterward, the fatigue and lingering tension in the body, often lasted for hours or even days following an activation. It was not something either of them sought out or enjoyed, but rather a capability they hoped never to need again, despite knowing it remained available when truly necessary. Threlorun returned moments later, informing the group that station security had spotted a third individual near the docking bay, believed to be connected to the earlier incident. He requested Daniel's assistance, noting that human security methods had proven remarkably effective and might help apprehend the fleeing suspect before he escaped the station entirely. Daniel agreed immediately, rising from his seat with the same quiet readiness he had shown earlier that day. Grace hesitated, clearly uneasy about Daniel returning to potential danger so soon after the first incident, but she said nothing, understanding that this was simply part of the responsibility both Daniel and Claire had accepted long ago. Claire chose to stay behind this time, tasked with continuing her analysis of the deactivated device, believing it held crucial clues about who exactly had funded and organized the failed attempt to disrupt humanity's council membership. Daniel followed Threlorun through a maze of corridors leading toward the lower levels of the station, moving efficiently and without wasted motion. Security drones flanked them from a respectful distance, their earlier hesitation completely replaced by full cooperation, now that emergency protocols had been formally authorized. Daniel's senses remained sharp, though this time there was no immediate danger to a hostage, only the careful pursuit of a single fleeing suspect. Corandal, meanwhile, ducked into a narrow service corridor, his breathing ragged, as he tried desperately to think of another way off the station. He had never anticipated needing a backup plan, confident that his companion's original scheme would succeed without complications. Now, with security closing in from multiple directions, he began to realize just how thoroughly their entire operation had unraveled within the span of a single afternoon. Daniel reached the entrance to the service corridor just as Corin attempted to slip through a maintenance hatch leading toward the station's outer hull. He called out calmly, identifying himself and urging Corin to stop, explaining that further resistance would only make his situation worse. Corin hesitated at the hatch, torn between the slim chance of escape and the growing realization that there was truly nowhere left to run. Threlorun's security drones moved to seal off the remaining corridors, cutting off every possible route Corin might have considered. Daniel approached slowly, his hands visible and open, his tone remaining steady and non-threatening despite the tense standoff. He reminded Corin that cooperation now would be viewed far more favorably than continued resistance, appealing to reason rather than force, much as Grace had done earlier with the first intruder. Corin's shoulders finally sagged, the fight draining out of him as he recognized the futility of his position. He stepped away from the hatch, raising his hands in surrender, his earlier confidence completely replaced by quiet resignation. Daniel guided him gently toward the waiting security team, careful to ensure the situation concluded without any unnecessary escalation, mindful of maintaining the same restraint that had defined his actions throughout the entire day. With all three conspirators finally secured, Threlorun contacted the council chamber to deliver the news, his voice carrying a mixture of relief and lingering astonishment. He praised Daniel's assistance openly, acknowledging that human methods had proven invaluable in resolving the situation swiftly and safely. The council, still reeling from the earlier events, received the news with quiet gratitude, though the larger questions raised by the day's events remained far from settled. Back in the meeting room, Grace received word of Corin's capture and allowed herself a small, relieved breath. She turned to Vorkaith, gently steering the conversation back toward the broader implications of what the council had witnessed that day. She reminded him that humanity had not asked to demonstrate this capability, and hoped sincerely that today's events would not overshadow the genuine desire for peaceful cooperation that had brought humanity to the council in the first place. Vorkaith assured her that his species, along with the rest of the council, would approach the matter with careful consideration, rather than fear or hostility. Yet privately, he could not shake the feeling that humanity's file within the council's vast archives would need a substantial and permanent revision, one that acknowledged a truth far more complex and formidable than anyone had previously understood. Threlorun returned to the meeting room briefly to confirm that Corin Dahl had been placed in secure holding alongside his two companions, all three now awaiting formal questioning once the council's investigative team arrived from a neighboring station. He mentioned, almost as an afterthought, that Corin had said very little during his capture, offering no resistance but also no explanation for his involvement in the failed plot against humanity's council membership. Grace asked whether the council intended to pursue a full investigation into who had organized and funded the attempt, rather than simply processing the three captured individuals as isolated actors. Threlorun confirmed that such an investigation would indeed proceed, explaining that the sophistication of the countdown device alone suggested resources and planning far beyond what three individuals could have assembled entirely on their own initiative. Daniel offered to make himself and Claire available for any further assistance the investigative team might require, noting that human forensic techniques, while different from many council methods, had proven useful during similar situations back on Earth. Threlorun accepted the offer gratefully, acknowledging that combining human and council investigative approaches might yield insights that neither method could achieve entirely on its own. Vorkaith listened to this exchange with quiet interest, increasingly struck by how naturally humanity seemed to approach every challenge with a blend of caution, cooperation, and quiet competence. He found himself wondering how many other assumptions about humanity's newest council members might similarly need reconsideration, given how dramatically today's events had already overturned his own earlier expectations regarding their capabilities and character. As the afternoon light through the station's observation windows began to shift toward the artificial dusk cycle maintained throughout the facility, Grace suggested they conclude the discussion for the day, allowing everyone involved time to rest and process the events that had unfolded. Vorkaith agreed readily, expressing his intention to formally request a broader council session in the coming days, one dedicated entirely to understanding humanity's history and capabilities in far greater depth than today's brief conversation had allowed. 3 days after the incident, the council convened a special session, one unlike any held since humanity had first joined the galactic community. Word of the events in the Grand Chamber had spread quickly across every member world, prompting demands from curious and cautious delegates alike for a formal explanation. Grace Whitfield stood once again at the central platform, though this time the chamber held no danger, only rows of attentive faces waiting to hear what she had to say. She began by thanking the council for its patience and understanding during the recovery period, particularly acknowledging Emma Foley's courage throughout the ordeal. Emma sat quietly among the human delegation, fully recovered though still processing the experience, offering Grace a small, grateful smile as she spoke. Grace then turned toward the heart of the matter, addressing the question every delegate in the chamber had been waiting to ask since the moment the crisis ended. She explained that humanity's evolutionary history stretched back far longer than most council members realized, shaped by countless generations of survival on a planet filled with genuine physical danger. Early humans, she explained, had developed alongside powerful predators and unpredictable environments, forcing their ancestors to become skilled hunters and cooperative defenders in order to survive. Over time, this necessity shaped certain instincts deep within human biology, instincts related to focus, coordination, and controlled response under extreme threat. Grace clarified that this trait, sometimes informally referred to by humans themselves as an old survival instinct, rarely appeared in modern life. She explained that humanity's civilization had developed specifically to minimize situations requiring such extreme responses, building societies based on cooperation, law, and peaceful conflict resolution instead. The instinct remained present within human biology, she admitted, but centuries of deliberate cultural and educational effort ensured it stayed dormant for the vast majority of people throughout their entire lives. A delegate from a distant waterworld raised a cautious question, asking whether this meant every human carried the potential for such sudden, dramatic capability. Daniel Cole, standing quietly beside Grace, answered this time, explaining that while the underlying biological potential existed broadly across the species, actually accessing it in a controlled, purposeful way required extensive specialized training. Most humans, he clarified, would never experience anything close to what unfolded in the chamber that day, living their entire lives without ever needing such a response. Another delegate, a sharp-featured being from a mountainous world known for its rigid social hierarchies, asked why humanity had chosen to suppress such a valuable trait, rather than embrace and cultivate it openly. Claire Bishop answered this question herself, her voice calm but carrying genuine conviction. She explained that humanity had learned through its own difficult history that unleashing such capability without restraint led only to suffering, conflict, and irreversible harm among its own people. She continued, explaining that humanity's long journey toward peaceful cooperation, both within their own species and now among the stars, depended entirely on choosing restraint over raw capability whenever possible. The instinct existed, she acknowledged, but its true value lay not in constant use, but in knowing it remained available only for genuine moments of necessity, protecting others rather than dominating them. This distinction, she emphasized, mattered more to humanity than any council member might initially assume. Elder Vorkaeth, seated prominently among the council members, spoke next, sharing his own perspective, following his private conversation with the human delegation days earlier. He admitted openly that his initial assumptions about humanity had been proven incomplete, shaped by limited observation rather than genuine understanding. He expressed sincere respect for the deliberate restraint humanity practiced, noting that many species throughout the galaxy's history had struggled far more with controlling their own inherent capabilities. Threll Oren added his own observations, describing the remarkable efficiency and precision demonstrated during the crisis, along with the complete absence of unnecessary harm throughout the entire encounter. He noted that both intruders, along with the third conspirator captured later, remained entirely unharmed, despite the swift and decisive nature of their apprehension. This restraint, he suggested, spoke volumes about humanity's true character, perhaps even more than the capability itself. A murmur of agreement spread through the chamber, though not every delegate shared such immediate acceptance. A delegate from a distant asteroid colony, known for its historically cautious approach to new alliances, raised concerns about the long-term implications of humanity's newly revealed capability. She asked pointedly whether the Council should reconsider certain aspects of humanity's membership agreement, given this significant new information about the species' true nature. Grace addressed this concern directly, without defensiveness or hesitation. She reminded the Chamber that humanity's application for Council membership had always been offered honestly, including access to their complete historical records, biological studies, and cultural development. She pointed out that this trait had never been deliberately concealed, simply rarely relevant enough to require detailed explanation during earlier diplomatic exchanges between the species. She continued, explaining that humanity welcomed continued dialogue, and even independent study of this capability, provided it was conducted with mutual respect and genuine scientific curiosity, rather than fear or suspicion. She emphasized that humanity's goal in joining the Council remained exactly what it had always been: peaceful cooperation, shared knowledge, and mutual growth among the diverse species now working together across the galaxy. The asteroid colony delegate considered this response carefully, her earlier tension visibly softening as she absorbed Grace's sincere and measured words. She nodded slowly, acknowledging that perhaps her initial concerns had stemmed more from surprise than genuine distrust, and expressed openness toward further understanding, rather than immediate reconsideration of humanity's standing within the Council. Vorkaith called for a brief pause in the proceedings, allowing delegates time to reflect on everything discussed so far. During the recess, several Council members approached the human delegation directly, curious to learn more about Daniel and Claire's specialized training, the history behind humanity's ancient instincts, and how such capability had remained largely unknown despite years of prior diplomatic contact. Daniel found himself answering question after question with patience, explaining concepts that felt entirely ordinary to him, yet clearly fascinated the alien delegates gathered around him. He described the rigorous physical and mental training required to safely access such heightened focus, emphasizing repeatedly that discipline and restraint formed the true foundation of the entire practice, far more important than raw capability alone. Claire spoke separately with a group of alien scientists eager to understand the biological mechanisms behind the instinct's activation. She answered carefully, mindful of respecting certain sensitivities around sharing detailed medical information, while still satisfying their genuine scientific curiosity, with clear, thoughtful explanations, grounded in humanity's own extensive research into the subject over many generations. As the session resumed, Elder Vorkaith addressed the full chamber once more, his tone reflective and measured. He acknowledged that today marked a turning point in how the Council understood its newest member species, moving beyond simple classification of prey or predator toward a far more nuanced appreciation of humanity's unique evolutionary journey and deliberate cultural choices. He proposed formally updating humanity's official Council file, replacing outdated assumptions with accurate, respectful documentation, reflecting everything learned through this experience. Several delegates voiced immediate support for the proposal, recognizing that understanding, rather than fear, offered the strongest foundation for continued cooperation among all Council members moving forward into an uncertain but hopeful future together. Grace thanked the Council sincerely for their willingness to listen and understand, expressing genuine hope that this experience would strengthen rather than weaken the bonds between humanity and its fellow Council members. She reaffirmed humanity's continued commitment to peaceful cooperation, emphasizing that today's revelations, however dramatic, ultimately reflected the very values humanity hoped to contribute to the wider galactic community moving forward. As the session drew toward its conclusion, a quiet sense of mutual respect settled over the chamber, replacing the earlier tension and uncertainty that had defined the days following the crisis. Delegates from dozens of worlds exchanged thoughtful glances, many reconsidering long-held assumptions not just about humanity, but about the value of genuine curiosity and open dialogue when encountering the unexpected within any newly discovered species. A delegate representing a species known throughout the galaxy for its long tradition of scholarly record-keeping requested formal permission to publish an official account of the day's proceedings, hoping to preserve an accurate record for future generations of Council historians. Grace consented on behalf of the human delegation, provided that Emma Foley's privacy remained protected, and that the account focused on lessons learned rather than sensationalized details of the crisis itself. The scholarly delegate thanked her sincerely, noting that such balanced perspective was precisely why the Council valued humanity's growing presence among its ranks. He explained that many species throughout Council history had struggled to discuss their own difficult pasts openly, yet humanity seemed willing to acknowledge both its strengths and its complicated history with remarkable honesty, a quality he believed would serve the entire Council well in the years ahead. Near the back of the chamber, a group of younger delegates, still early in their diplomatic careers, discussed the day's events quietly among themselves during the recess. One admitted feeling genuinely humbled by what she had witnessed, admitting that her own species held long-standing pride in their perceived physical superiority among council members, a pride she now recognized as somewhat shallow compared to the deliberate, thoughtful restraint humanity had demonstrated throughout the crisis. Another young delegate wondered aloud whether other species within the council might harbor similarly hidden capabilities, traits shaped by their own ancient evolutionary pressures yet rarely discussed openly within diplomatic circles. The conversation sparked genuine curiosity among the group, several delegates resolving to research their own species' evolutionary history with fresh eyes once the session concluded, inspired by humanity's willingness to speak honestly about its own complicated nature. As the special session gradually wound toward its close, Grace found a quiet moment to speak privately with Emma, checking once more on her well-being following such an intense and public discussion of the crisis she had personally endured. Emma assured Grace that she felt stronger with each passing day, grateful for the Council's genuine interest in understanding, rather than merely reacting with fear, and increasingly proud to represent humanity during such a pivotal moment in their ongoing relationship with the wider galaxy. In a secure interrogation room several levels below the Grand Chamber, Koren Dahl sat across a narrow table from Threl Arun, his earlier defiance now replaced by a tired, resigned silence. Daniel Cole stood quietly near the door, present at Threl Arun's request, his calm presence somehow encouraging honesty from suspects far more effectively than any aggressive interrogation tactic could achieve. Koren stared at the table for a long moment before finally beginning to speak. He admitted that the plan had never truly originated with him or his two captured companions. They had been recruited months earlier by an anonymous contact who provided funding, equipment, and detailed information about the Council's security protocols, promising a significant reward for successfully disrupting humanity's continued membership. Koren claimed he never learned the true identity of this contact, communicating only through encrypted messages routed through multiple relay points across several star systems. Threl Arun pressed further, asking whether Koren knew the contact's motivations for opposing humanity so strongly. Koren shrugged weakly, explaining that he had assumed simple prejudice at first, a lingering distrust toward the newest and least understood species within the Council. But he admitted that certain details in their communications suggested something deeper, perhaps a rival faction genuinely fearful of what humanity's presence might eventually mean for the established balance of power among older species. Daniel listened carefully, filing away every detail for later analysis, though he said nothing during the questioning itself. He understood that today's confession, however incomplete, represented only the beginning of a much larger investigation that would likely continue long after this particular crisis had faded from immediate Council attention. The true architect behind the failed plot remained hidden, a loose thread that would require patience and careful work to eventually unravel. Claire, meanwhile, continued her own analysis in a separate laboratory, examining the deactivated device alongside a team of Council forensic specialists. Together, they traced several components back to a manufacturing signature associated with a black market network operating along the galaxy's outer trade routes. It was not conclusive proof of any single organization's involvement, but it offered a promising lead that Council investigators could pursue in the weeks ahead. Grace Whitfield spent much of that same day meeting privately with Emma Foley, ensuring her young colleague received proper support following such a traumatic experience. Emma admitted that she still felt shaken at times, replaying those tense moments in the chamber whenever she closed her eyes, though she expressed deep gratitude for how quickly and carefully Daniel and Claire had acted to protect her throughout the entire ordeal. Grace reassured her gently, explaining that such feelings were entirely natural following a genuinely frightening experience, and that healing simply took time and patience. She offered Emma the option of returning home for a period of rest, though Emma surprised her by declining, insisting instead that she wanted to remain with the delegation, determined not to let fear diminish her commitment to humanity's continued presence within the Council. Word of the crisis and its resolution continued spreading rapidly across the galaxy's many inhabited worlds during the days that followed. News networks on dozens of planets covered the story extensively, though interpretations varied considerably depending on each species' particular cultural perspective. Some portrayed humanity with newfound admiration, praising their restraint and effectiveness under extreme pressure. Others expressed cautious unease, uncertain how to categorize a species capable of such dramatic transformation, from calm diplomacy to decisive action within mere seconds. On a distant trading outpost known for hosting representatives from nearly every council member species, conversations about the incident dominated casual gatherings for weeks afterward. Merchants and travelers exchanged theories and opinions freely, some half-joking that humans should never be underestimated during business negotiations, while others discussed more seriously what humanity's capability might mean for future diplomatic relations across the wider galactic community. Back at Council headquarters, Elder Vorkaith found himself reflecting deeply on everything that had transpired since that tense afternoon in the Grand Chamber. He requested access to humanity's complete historical archives, spending considerable time studying their long, often difficult journey from early tribal societies toward the peaceful, cooperative civilization that had eventually earned council membership. The deeper he read, the more he understood the remarkable effort humanity had invested in choosing cooperation over conflict. He discovered detailed accounts of humanity's own historical struggles with unchecked aggression, painful lessons learned across countless generations, before finally developing the social structures, educational systems, and shared values that now defined their modern civilization. It became clear to him that the instinct witnessed during the crisis represented not humanity's defining characteristic, but rather a carefully managed exception to the compassionate, cooperative nature they had worked so hard to cultivate as their true cultural identity. Vorkaith requested another private meeting with Grace, Daniel, and Claire, this time approaching the conversation with genuine warmth rather than cautious curiosity. He shared what he had learned from his research, expressing sincere admiration for humanity's difficult but ultimately successful journey toward peaceful cooperation. He admitted candidly that his own species, along with several others in the Council, still struggled significantly with fully controlling their own inherent aggressive tendencies. Grace thanked him for his thoughtful reflection, acknowledging that every species within the Council carried its own unique history, challenges, and lessons learned along the way toward peaceful coexistence. She expressed hope that humanity's experience might offer useful insight to other member species still working through similar struggles of their own, fostering greater understanding and cooperation across the entire Council, rather than division or fear. Daniel added quietly that he never wanted anyone to view what happened in the chamber as something to celebrate or admire excessively. He explained that despite the necessity of his actions that day, he took no genuine pride in having to use such capability at all, viewing it instead as an unfortunate necessity, rather than an accomplishment worth boasting about. True strength, he suggested, lay not in the capability itself, but in the discipline required to keep it dormant until absolutely necessary. Claire agreed wholeheartedly, sharing that both she and Daniel underwent regular counseling and reflection following any activation of their training, ensuring they remained grounded and connected to the peaceful values that defined their everyday lives. She explained that humanity's approach to this capability mirrored their broader philosophy entirely, respecting power without glorifying it, and always prioritizing restraint, empathy, and cooperation whenever genuinely possible. Vorkaith listened intently, visibly moved by their thoughtful, humble perspective. He admitted that he had expected, perhaps even hoped, to witness pride or confidence following such a remarkable demonstration of capability, yet instead found himself deeply impressed by the quiet humility both Daniel and Claire carried regarding their own abilities. It reinforced, more than anything else, his growing respect for humanity's genuine character. Weeks later, the Council formally updated humanity's official file within its extensive archives, replacing outdated and incomplete assumptions with a far more accurate, respectful, and nuanced description of the species' true nature. The updated documentation acknowledged humanity's remarkable evolutionary history, their deliberate cultural restraint, and their genuine commitment to peaceful cooperation, while also respectfully noting the rare but formidable capability that remained available should circumstances ever truly demand it. Grace Whitfield read the updated file with quiet satisfaction, sharing it with Daniel, Claire, and Emma during a small gathering held within the human delegation's private quarters aboard the station. Emma, fully recovered and more confident than ever, remarked that she finally understood why humanity approached council membership with such careful humility from the very beginning, recognizing now just how much responsibility came alongside their unique place among the stars. Daniel raised a quiet toast that evening, not to celebrate any triumph, but simply to honor the safety and continued cooperation that had ultimately prevailed despite the day's earlier danger. Claire echoed his sentiment warmly, expressing gratitude that the crisis had ended without lasting harm to anyone involved, human or otherwise, reinforcing her belief that peaceful resolution remained humanity's true strength above all else. Across the galaxy, the story of that tense afternoon within the Grand Council chamber continued circulating for months afterward, gradually becoming less a source of fear and more a symbol of mutual understanding between vastly different species, learning to coexist together. Humanity's reputation shifted meaningfully within the Council, no longer viewed as fragile newcomers, nor feared as unpredictable threats, but respected instead as a thoughtful, disciplined species carrying both remarkable capability and genuine wisdom regarding its proper use. Elder Vorkaith often reflected afterward on the lessons that single afternoon had taught him, not just about humanity, but about the value of patience, curiosity, and genuine understanding when encountering the unknown. He came to believe that true wisdom lay not in immediately categorizing others based on limited observation, but in remaining open to discovering the deeper, often more complex truths that lay beneath every species' outward appearance and behavior. As council sessions resumed their usual peaceful rhythm in the months that followed, Grace, Daniel, Claire, and Emma continued their work within the human delegation, carrying forward the same quiet dedication that had defined their actions from the very beginning. The crisis had tested them profoundly, revealing capabilities and character that few among the council had previously understood. Yet through it all, their commitment to peaceful cooperation remained entirely unchanged, exactly as it had always been intended to be. On a quiet evening several months later, Grace stood alone near the observation windows of the station, watching distant stars drift slowly past as the facility continued its steady orbit. She thought back often to that tense afternoon in the Grand Chamber, not with fear, but with a quiet sense of pride in how her delegation had handled such an unexpected and dangerous situation. She thought of Daniel's calm restraint, Claire's precise focus, and Emma's quiet courage, each of them representing humanity in a way she found genuinely admirable. Daniel and Claire continued their work protecting the human delegation, their days returning largely to routine, though both privately hoped such extraordinary measures would rarely, if ever, be necessary again. They trained regularly, maintaining the discipline required to keep their unique capability both sharp and firmly under control, understanding that true mastery lay not in constant readiness for conflict, but in the quiet confidence that came from knowing they could respond if truly needed. Emma eventually rose within the diplomatic ranks, her first-hand experience with the crisis giving her a unique perspective that proved valuable during later negotiations with cautious or skeptical council members. She often spoke candidly about her ordeal when asked, choosing honesty over exaggeration, and consistently emphasizing the calm professionalism of Daniel and Claire, rather than dwelling on her own fear during those tense, uncertain moments. The investigation into the true architect behind the failed plot continued quietly in the background, council investigators slowly piecing together fragments of evidence gathered from the deactivated device and Corindal's limited testimony. Though the full truth remained elusive for some time, the effort itself demonstrated the council's genuine commitment to understanding the deeper causes behind the crisis, rather than simply moving past it without further examination. Elder Vorkaith remained a steady advocate for humanity within the council in the months that followed, often citing that tense afternoon as a turning point in his own understanding of how easily assumptions could obscure genuine truth. He encouraged fellow delegates repeatedly to approach every new discovery, whether about humanity or any other species, with patience and curiosity rather than hasty judgment, a lesson he credited entirely to what he had witnessed that day. In time, the story of that afternoon settled into the Council's broader history, remembered not as a moment of fear, but as the day understanding triumphed over assumption, and cooperation proved stronger than suspicion. Humanity's place among the stars grew steadier and more secure, built not on the dramatic instinct witnessed so briefly within the chamber, but on the quiet, consistent choice to meet every challenge, however unexpected, with discipline, honesty, and an enduring hope for peace.